Antonis, would you please confirm if you can hear me one more time?
Yes, I'm hearing you.
All right, thank you. Okay, so let's start. Um, Hi, everybody, and welcome to our seminar this month as we explore, what fundi wa simu, which means fund repair technician in Nairobi, can teach us about, building more grounded, culturally aware AI systems. Today, we've been joined by our guest speaker, Daniel Mwesigwa. And Daniel is a PhD candidate in information science at Cornell University. And in this talk, Daniel is going to, in this talk titled Against Softmaxing Culture, Understanding Relational Practices in Expert and Ordinary Forms of Work, Daniel will discuss, how everyday norms, rules, values, and expectations shape collaboration and exchange. Why designing AI for such dynamic environments require careful consideration of cultural complexities, and why AI development requires more grounded and context-sensitive evaluation approaches. So more about Daniel. He is a PhD candidate, as I've said, at Cornell University with a major in socio-cultural anthropology. His research spans HCI, CSTW, and AI policy. He was previously an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. Thank you very much, Daniel, for joining us, and thanks for agreeing to give us a talk today. And over to you, Daniel.
All right. Thank you so much, Millicent. I hope people online can hear me. If they can't, I'm happy to shout. But hello from Nairobi.
I can hear you clearly.
Amazing. Thank you for that generous introduction. My name once again is Daniel, and I really come to this topic as an outsider. So I am neither, in the typical sense, a computer scientist, nor am I, in the typical sense, an anthropologist. So the way I come into this is through like a synthetic mix of different disciplines and different commitments. And I believe it's very relevant, especially for this new age of AI, machine learning, and generative AI, broadly speaking. So most of this talk is really going to be framed in a very conversational and I should say philosophical sense, although most of the work is grounded in my own field experience as an ethnographer of technology. And I'd like to start this talk with very broad claims that I want to make, and I'm framing them as really as provocations. So the first provocation that I want to make with regard to culture and AI, or basically culturally aligned AI, is that they are indeed are cultural universals. So for computer scientists, or many people, technical side, that's kind of obvious. But some people on the more sort of sciencey, humanistic side, like anthropology and sociology and cultural theory, would shudder at this claim. The second claim and provocation is that the question, what is culture in AI, is the wrong question to start with. And to start with, in this case, it's a qualification for when we are starting our research and building and evaluation and the like. All right, let's get into it. So I have a quick question for you. What do M-Pesa and ChatGPT have in common? You don't have to tell me your answer, just think about it. Of course, if your answer is they both have green in their logos, you probably are not too far away from the truth. But I want to impress upon you some of the commonalities that I think are important to consider. I think one, both of them are artifacts. So artifacts are both technical. M-Pesa has an app and it uses the app as well. ChatGPT, as we know it, also has an app. And some of the other artifacts include the APIs through which they are accessed. Then also they include or they imbricate a wide range of actors. So this could be the companies that are building them. And on the other hand, this could also include the end users. So you and I, and how we use these apps and products. Third is the aspirations. So basically, what do these products try to do? On the one hand, you can have M-Pesa aiming to facilitate financial inclusion, and you might have ChatGPT through OpenAI trying to basically build beneficial AGI, quote unquote, for the benefit of humanity. And so I basically want to say that these three buckets through which we can try and understand the commonalities actually have very strong bearings that have social, cultural, and economic import. And I have indeed explored some of this work in a paper that was published at CHI. And here I was specifically looking at the intellectual history of M-Pesa. You might enjoy that paper if M-Pesa is part of your interest. All right, but I also want to make a really broader claim here. The technology, the way we think about it, is social and cultural. And specifically, I want us to segue and carefully think about large AI technologies, such as ChatGPT, as I've already introduced. So recent work, and here I'm drawing on a paper that was recently published in Science, was making this exact claim that large AI models or large AI technologies are in fact social and cultural. And the reason why this is the case is because they contribute actively in how we make meaning of information, either deposited in libraries and on the internet and some of the largest repositories like Wikipedia. But the fundamental point here they're trying to make is beyond just them being able to enable us to summarize and understand and interpret content, they are also reorganizing and reconstructing information. So in other words, they are generative. Now, I want to say and suggest, based off my my title, which is Against Softmaxing Culture, is these technologies are potentially softmaxing culture. So culture might be dynamic, might be contested, might be complex, but what these technologies do is in a way flatten. And I've coined the term softmaxing culture, and I'm defining it as a tendency of AI systems to produce averages or defaults of language and media in human AI interaction. Let me give you a toy example, which is a really quick demo of autocomplete and how softmax might work out in practice. So let's assume you've been asked the question, what's your favorite city? And you are completing this on a text. And your answer is, my favorite city is N. So as you're typing in N, it kind of completes for you New York. Of course, I think New York is many people's favorite city and maybe dream city. But in this toy case, really the favorite city is Nairobi. So the argument here I'm trying to make is softmaxing culture is a way, is defaulting to what the data is commonly trained on. So since New York is overrepresented in the data in the data sets, in a way it's being sampled as the most probable case. And some of the implications include, as a recent article in the Atlantic shows, there's been a great language flattening. So in a way, languages are being homogenized and what John Kleinberg might call algorithmic monoculture. Now, there is also another damning side to this, which is the claim that actually these technologies perhaps are only regurgitating content. Of course, there are caveats, and I think this claim of stochastic parrots has been kind of questioned. But some of the bigger claims that actually the authors here are making on You're Not a Parrot is the actually biases and harms that are perpetuated because of minority linguistic representations. All right. Having said that, I would like to move on onto the structure of my talk. So as I said at the start, there are two provocations. The first one is the culture universals. The second one is the question, what is culture, is the wrong question. So the way I've set this up, the first provocation is going to be like a survey of the literature and some of the big claims around how culture is thought about, and also how culture is accounted for in systems, and eventually how it's evaluated. The second part is going to be based on my empirical work, and we shall be answering the question, what can human AI interaction learn from phone repair technicians, or in Swahili, fundi wa simu? All right, let's get into the first provocation. Okay, so if I ask you what is culture, I don't know what will happen in your mind, or I don't know what you think about. You definitely have like a sketch or a mental framework on how to think about culture or reason about it. So you might think about it as a software of the mind, as a very popular anthropologist has suggested, Gerd Hofstede, and I'll talk about him in a minute. You might think about it in symbolic dimension, looking at culture as a system of signs and symbols through which we are embedded and through which we have to make interpretations. You might look at economic dimensions. What does it mean for how we're producing and consuming? And several other dimensions. So there is so much to consider that actually people who are doing this kind of work in machine learning and in HCI, human-computer interaction, have been grappling with this question for a long while. And there have been two camps that have really emerged. The one camp is what basically tries to integrate all of these dimensions into one definition. And the second camp is what optimizes for the local or the particular, basically reasoning that culture is only situated in the places through which local action happens. So I want to explore this quickly. And I really want to talk about the dominant model of how people and researchers in machine learning and human-computer interaction broadly think about culture. So this is based on Gerd Hofstede, who was an anthropologist at IBM in the 70s and 80s, and I think until the 90s, and he did most of this work in the Netherlands. So there were these surveys that IBM was making every year, basically trying to understand different things that their staff and researchers really cared about. So Hofstede says that he stumbled upon this by dint of chance. So in other words, he went through the data and the theory of culture really emerged to him. He integrates the definition of culture as a software of the mind, not individually, but more like a collective software of the mind. And he has different ways that he evaluates culture. And I must say that his program has been very influential in the social sciences and also in machine learning and AI spaces. So I may not have time to go through all of these dimensions, but I will just quickly mention them and what they mean. But it's also important to add that Hofstede's evaluation regime is really based at the national scale. So it's very macro and collectivist in grounding. So the first one is power distance. Basically, the argument is how people in a given society, or organization, or institution accept their position in society. And this, he kind of says, countries where there is low power distance, like the US, is because they kind of like do not, people do not exactly accept their positions. But it says more conservative countries, like countries in East Asia, have higher power distances. Second one is uncertainty of avoidance, which is basically not about avoiding risk, but basically dealing with ambiguity. And he also has a list of countries that he pits against each other. The other one is individualism versus collectivism, which is almost one of the most contentious ones. And it's self-explanatory, but some of his findings from his data was that countries that are more individualistic are more wealthy compared to those that are collectivist. But of course, some of the issues in social science is around causality. And in fact, some of the studies showed that it was the other way around. It was the wealth that was causing more individualism. The fourth is about masculinity and femininity. So Hofstede here is looking at traditional gender roles and how they're played. And again, this is not individual, but it's collectivist and it's thinking on the national level. So countries like Germany, the US are more masculine, and countries like the Netherlands, Indonesia are more feminine. The fifth is long. So the first four was what he started out with from the survey, and the survey has since evolved in the last few decades. And so the fifth and the sixth were additions. So the fifth is long-term versus short-term orientation, which is drawn on Confucian logics. So basically Chinese ideologies on how to think about life and work. And those who valued long-term tended to be mostly in East Asia versus those for short-term orientation. The sixth, which is indulgence versus restraint, is embedded in happiness research, but you might think about it as hedonism index. And countries that indulge more tended to be Western oriented and Africa, and those that were more restrained were in East Asia. Okay, so you probably have questions and concerns about this kind of evaluation regime. And it's not perfect, but one thing that vindicates it, if you look up on Google Scholar, is it's been widely adopted. And if you look at some of the papers in machine learning on Archive and other publications like ACL, NeurIPS, ICML, you will see that even though most of the models are engaging with these evaluations of culture and its progression, the cultural map of the world, which really is built on Hofstede's model, you will see that there is a tension, even if there is a recognition that this model or this evaluation regime is helping, either in fine-tuning and in collecting different kinds of data sets for different kinds of tasks, including to deal with stereotypes and biases, you can still see, and I would say as a social scientist, I was surprised by the level of reflection and concern in very many of the machine learning NLP papers that I reviewed. Now, this is the other school of thinking. I wouldn't really call it a school, but this is like a counterpoint. And the argument here is that culture is not trivia. Like culture is not geographical trivia, is not a macro sociological trivia where you just pit genders against each other and other large abstract categories. Culture is very complex and dynamic. And this really, I like this because it comes from a paper from NLP thinkers who are really deeply embedded in cultural theory. And I just want to point out three major points that they're making in the paper before I segue into the next part. So they're arguing here that most of the definitions of culture, as I've mentioned, are very unsatisfactory. So as I've shown, they tend to be on larger scales, like national levels, that are not representative, especially on downstream tasks that we see mostly in natural language generation or generative AI programs. The second point that they're making here is the data set or benchmark construction, benchmarking that happens, most of the data, they argue that it's stereotypical. So this work is grounded in sociolinguistics, which is the interaction between society and language. And stereotypes in this case is not necessarily biases, although when you think about biases against groups of people, that suffices. But what they think about stereotypes here are what they frame as like meta level of thinking or meta pragmatic expressions. So a concrete example here is when you talk about my accent being Ugandan or Kenyan, or if I roll my R and I sound like I come from New York, that is the kind of stereotype that they associate. And most of the data that has been collected, especially in benchmarks such as Culture Bank, tend to really capture the stereotypes. So in a way, it ends up being stereotypes all the way down. And this is a very bleak picture. So what the authors suggest, in fact, is that we should have some kind of cultural competence. Basically, where we do a trade-off between generalization. So how general do we represent different kinds of groups of people, different kinds of languages, versus the nuance? How deep do we go into specifying? And just using the same case of a stereotype, and in a more broad sense, is that sometimes people or users of systems might recognize a particular stereotype about their group of people, and they would like to see it represented, for example, when they're prompting, but they wouldn't want to see it in the natural language generation. So the intervention here is that we should focus more on localization. We should build smaller models, baby models, but those that address particular situations. In this case, we're able to collect data and that is situated and more contextual, but then we are also able to work with expert data workers, including annotators and people doing the modeling, so that we can be able to build more relevant and localized systems. So as I've already explained, it seems like we have kind of like two camps. The one camp, which is the more Hofstede, is basically kind of universalizing culture. Then the other one is more about the particularization of culture. And I want to provide a synthesis from an unlikely source. African philosopher from Ghana, Kwasi Wiredu, asked this provocative question: are there cultural universals? And his immediate answer is yes. Not for the reason that I've already articulated, but his simple reason was that if there is no cultural universals, then we wouldn't have intercultural communication. It's a very simple point, and he expands this in a book published in 1996 called Cultural Universals and Particulars. I'll briefly speak about 2 points and I'll segue into the next section of my talk. He says that the reason why we have cultural universals is precisely because humans share a cognitive toolkit. And this toolkit has different elements. So one of them is about the ability to make inferences. So the non-contradictory ability to tell X from not X. The other one is around induction. So ability to learn from examples. The other one is about inference, basically making judgment. The other one is about reflection, being able to think about your position in relation to other objects or people or things. And the other one is the ability to abstract, to basically start from particulars to generalities. And he argues that this is a fundamental toolkit that all humans share. Hold your horses. I know you might say large language models can do most of the stuff, but maybe we'll get into that in a minute. So he basically is arguing that even if we think about cultural and linguistic relativism, where there are different standards of like evaluating culture or evaluating ethics and morals, he says that we have a toolkit that enables us universally to be logical and engaging people. So one thing he mentioned that I think is really important to note here that might be useful is the thing on how we relate to our environments, both as biological and cultural beings, and how we perceive it. So he gives an example of an object, like what do we think of an object? Or what's our ability to actually conceptualize an object? So that falls within this cognitive toolkit. And he gives an example of the chair. And I know this is kind of pedantic philosophical talk, but just bear with me for a moment. For example, in English, you could abstract the property of a chair, the chairness of it. So in a way, it's an abstract noun. And English gives you the ability to actually thingify the quality of the chair. So the chair has a chance. It's an abstract noun. Just the same way red has a quality, redness. He does a comparison with his language, Akan, and I think it's true for very many languages in this part of the world, in Africa. Why he says that our languages do not have that kind of relationship to objects. So they kind of like go around talking about the quality of a chair. And in a way, when we're thinking about the things, we don't think about chair and chairness as objects, but in a way we think about them through their relational kind of connections. But this does not mean that the Akan or the Kikuyu or the Banyankore do not have the cognitive abilities for abstract thought. And in fact, he argues that the reason why this is important is because all cultures have different ways of understanding this through language, but then also through bodily and sensory faculties. And I want to conclude on this for Wiredu, is he says that another thing that really guides us is the principle of sympathetic impartiality. So he basically is making an argument that although we have all of these things that make us culturally universal, what really stands out in how we should think about the differences in different cultures or different places in the world is this sympathetic impartiality, which basically means the ability to put ourselves in another's position, to feel, to empathize, to reason. And on the one hand, there might be broad claims around fairness, around justice, and equity, but they might be operationalized differently in different communities. So he calls out customs as basically being a check on these broad values like justice. So in this way, if we have customs on how to reason about justice, they might vary, but then they are also subject to change. So he basically, if we are to think about Hofstede and culture is not trivia, we see that he's basically giving us this very beautiful tangle between what it means to be general, but also how the customs play an everyday role. And I think a quick example that I can give before I move on is around traffic rules. Of course, the value here might be around safety, but some of the customs that drive this could be either driving on the left or right. And that could be either an accident of chance. I shouldn't use the word accident for traffic rules, but could be a matter of chance. You tossed a coin and decided to drive on the left or right. Or could also be a matter of historical precedence. You're born in a country called Kenya that was colonized by the British, who happened to drive on a particular side of the road. So there's this tangle that is happening back and forth. But I'm happy to have an extended conversation. All right. So in a nutshell, culture is a fuzzy object. And for those who have been trying to understand how this applies to large language models or any other kinds of automated technologies that produce and generate and embedded in culture, they know that this is a challenge. And even if you kind of like run a search, you know that there are several queries that might return dissatisfying or unsatisfying answers. And that's why I think it's really, really important, as this paper that was recently published in CHI shows, that prompting is very challenging for experts, for non-experts, but I think there are also further studies that have showed how issues around prompt sensitivity have produced very varied and different results, especially when we're thinking about these very abstract concepts like culture. Okay, so I have motivated the first provocation. You might call it a hypothesis. And the claim here is the cultural universals, as indeed I've shown. Now I'm going to jump into the second provocation, which is the question, what is culture? Is the wrong question to start with. And some of this work, and most of this work indeed is embedded in my fieldwork on hanging out with mobile phone technicians in Kampala. I'll speak about that in a minute. So instead of asking what is culture, I propose that we ask when is culture. So this semantic shift should not be understood as basically trying to dodge the complexity of culture. I still think we would eventually have to define culture. So I'm framing this really as a social science evaluation challenge. Basically, I'm going all the way down to understand when culture becomes a valid ecological and relational practice and action. When we ask what is culture, what we're basically doing, we're reifying, or rather objectifying, and I should add, thingifying culture, and basically making it static so that we do not deal with its complexities. And by the way, when is culture, it's not broken English, but it's really a way to think about some of the conditions through which some of these cultures and cultural proximities become enacted in practice. And I really did this by trying to go an octave lower to understand when culture becomes a valid ecological and relational practice. So I've done this in my ongoing work, and I've proposed basically a texture of culture, and I'm calling this moral orders. I'll explain in a minute. So moral orders are norms, rules, values, and expectations that support and structure joint work and practice. So this work is really located in workshops, me hanging out with mobile phone technicians, trying to understand their practice. So a quick question here or thought could be, how does this relate with AI? How does this relate with culture in AI? And my quick answer here would be that since we're designing AI to be used in these cultural sites and social sites, and indeed work sites, we must be able to understand the norms and rules and values and expectations that actually play a huge role in these field sites. So I did not just theoretically come up with this concept. It really emerged in my fieldwork, and I conducted this work in Kampala between 2022 to July 2024.
Daniel, sorry, but the room's mic, I think, is on mute.
Can you ask?
Yeah, can hear you now. Maybe start from this slide.
All right, cool. So I do not theoretically, when I said theoretically, I don't mean machine learning theory or math theory, formal proofs. I mean more like social theory. And that's where I locate most of my work. This was a principally field-based thinking or kind of reasoning through which we try and understand how culture is operationalized and when actually we can begin touching its textures and feeling its dimensions in practice. And I quickly want to give you a cast of actors in my field site. So this is empirical work, drawing off my ethnography. So basically ethnography means hanging out with people and seeing them do their work in real time. So there are four categories of people that I encountered. The first categories were repairers. Second were suppliers. Third were clients, basically people who consume technology or repair services. And fourth were middlemen. But one thing that really stood out for me was how fluid these roles seem to be. But one thing that really stood out for me is how almost every actor in this repair world was a middleman, was a mediator. So in Luganda, this says which loosely means that everyone, including repairers, suppliers, and clients, were middlemen. And this has very strong implications on how we think about roles, either structured by gender, by socioeconomic class, by skill level, how we think about how we place these people in these fixed categories. But this fluidity would made me understand more about some of the cultural and economic positioning that different people took as actually not only as a means of survival, but also as a means of making an extra income to thrive. And I identified three key dimensions of these textures of culture that I'm calling moral orders. And in the interest of time, I'm quickly going to go through two of them. So, drawing off the conversation that I've already, the kind of provocations I've already set up, when we think about fair exchange, we really think about it in a very Aristotelian notion of fairness, fair for different parties in an exchange. When we think about relational accountability, we think about how different parties should basically have established and standard conditions on how to be accountable to each other. But what I encountered in the field was quite different, but still does not challenge the fact that these are actually universal categories, broadly speaking. So the first is fair exchange. Let's quickly go through it. So my cast here of actors, I'm calling them the X-Men. And to be sure, all of these names are not real because of research ethics practices. So I have Javier and Xander. Javier is a mobile phone repairer who's been working for about 8 years. And Xander has been working with Javier for the last 5 years. Both of them are repairers. But in a way, Javier is the boss in this repair shop. So the question I'm asking here is, what constitutes a fair exchange? In this encounter, a client, a middle-aged man with a Motorola phone E20, earlier has suffered misfortune. His phone fell down and cracked the screen open. Now, he's known Xavier for a while, and he wants help. He wants the screen to be replaced. So when you think about a mobile phone repair, you think when your phone falls down, like Xavier's probably cracks the screen open, you'll be sad. Then you go to a repairer will fix the phone, and maybe you'll be happy. That's wrong. What happens is that fair exchange is really a negotiation that includes different kinds of actors, including repairers, suppliers, middlemen, and the client. The key insight that I want us to take from this fair exchange, and this is from Xander, this is Xander who told me as my interlocutor, and he's a repairer. He told me that they wanted to ensure that the client did not feel like he was cheated. They basically charged the client more than 50% of what it cost them to fix this phone. This is fairness. This is how business works for them. The second is around relational accountability. So who is responsible for whom in this repair works? And I want to tell you a curious case of a young man called Jama. So Jama is a Swahili word, but here I'm using it as a name. So Jama, as you can see, his arm stretched out. Of course, I cannot take pictures of his face for ethics reasons. He humanizes signposts. If you haven't been to downtown Kampala, you probably may not understand the role of this. Buildings are a parade of signposts. It's very overwhelming where to go for different kinds of services. But what Jama does in this case is imbue action and hopefully take people to his boss whom he works with. But what happens is that most of this work that Jama does is illegal, is criminal, at least according to historical precedent. Of course, we know in common law, most of these kind of charges were framed as being idle and disorderly and being a nuisance to public order. But what happens in this case is that Jama gets arrested. But has he gotten arrested out of his own work and his own volition, or has he gotten arrested because he's trying to do extra work for his boss? So in this case, Jamal actually was able to negotiate for his freedom. I'm not sure how long it was. I'm not sure when he was arrested again, but he was able to do this by appealing to different kinds of managers and bosses he was working with. And the claim here is that this is a kind of relational accountability that depends on actors' knowledge and information on how to navigate the system. So there are three key dimensions as I've laid out. And these are really, I want you to think about them as textures of culture at a more lower level. So these are really the norms, the customs, the rules, the values and expectations on how this plays out. So as I've shown, fair exchange is horizontal, whereby it flattens real perceived differences between clients and repairers. And it generated a sense, at least on both sides, both on the client side, as a man who broke his E20 screen, and also Xavier and Xander, that exchange was conducted on even grounds. The second, relational accountability is vertical. So these are claims made by those whom feel that they're hierarchically below different kinds of actors. So in this case, Jama felt he's hierarchically below his bosses, the repairers, and he felt they owed him the duty and the responsibility to send him bail money because he was basically doing work for them. Okay, so I'm almost coming towards the end of my presentation, and I wanted to really show a key takeaway. Through understanding these textures of culture, which I'm calling moral orders, I want to show that they are multiple, they are opaque, and they're overlapping. And they're really internal to these worlds. So they're really internal to these workshops. They're internal to these offices and field sites through which this kind of work happens. But in a way, they're also external. So they're external because when we see them playing out in action, they basically leave the background and come to the foreground. But the biggest point I'm trying to make here is that these moral orders are actually hidden rules. You wouldn't see them unless you enter these worlds and navigate them and understand them. So some of these could be captured in surveys, some of it could be captured in diary studies, some of it could be captured in ethnographic observation. But some of it, and there's the possibility that some of it is hidden from the careful eye of researchers and developers. So my question was, what can human AI interaction research learn from the practices of fundi simu? And I hope that I've shown some of these low-level dimensional textures through culture plays out. Now, I really want to show the design implications, but you could also look at these as policy implications that would be important for us to reason about culture and how we account for it in different benchmarks, and how we include it in, say, our fine-tuning programs, but then also our broader system and societal evaluation regimes. So I have three broad implications. First is that understanding context is inescapable. It's really important, especially if you think about building local or building for particular industries or sectors where there are different values, norms, and expectations that might be challenging and complex. So this might speak, whereas I've shown that the question that is important to ask first is when is culture, this helps us to systematize these conditions and concretely come up with ways to explain what culture is and what kind of either proxies and parameters we can develop and what kind of instruments we eventually use to evaluate or design. Second, and this is a more meta level, broader kind of implication, is that it's high time to integrate social sciences and humanities with machine learning and data science. You'll note that I'm not saying interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary work. I'm actually talking about integration. And we've seen some theories from the social sciences and linguistics that have been empirically proven. And I think this is a chance for actually for us to have this kind of conversation on how to think about working closely together and integrating our intellectual projects for the greater good. The final implication is about the systematization of fine-tuning and different kind of evaluations. So I think here I'm looking at the data, and this third point is closely related to the first point. And so there is nothing like raw, free, decontextualized data. All data comes when it is already cooked, comes with values that are latent and are latent within it. And I think if we bring all of this together, we'll be able to define different ways through which we can systematize not only the benchmarks that we create, but inevitably how we think about the definitions from the start. All right, so this is broadly what I presented, basically coming from the provocation that they are cultural universals and showing the dance between universals and particulars. And I showed in a concrete case that there is a particular case, which is a fundi wa simu site, where we can see these low-level textures of culture and how they play out. And I sketched out the dimensions that I think are important to understand, not only for understanding the context, but also enabling us to kind of define different ways through which different dimensions play out. So fair exchange is one of them, and relational accountability is the other. But I think the bigger point I'm trying to make here, which is probably above my pay grade, is that we need to integrate the social sciences and the humanities with machine learning, cognitive science, and data science. With that said, thanks so much for your time and listening. And these are the papers that I'm working on and I've published. Thank you so much.
Well, that was excellent, Daniel. Thank you very much for quite an insightful talk. So we have just one question on the chat. I wonder if, Remara, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question. Otherwise, I can just ask it for you if you want. Cool. Okay, let me just ask you for let me just ask it, Daniel. So Remara says, I did enjoy the book you referenced earlier. In my view, Hofstede's cultural dimensions theory both illuminates and obscures the dynamic nature of national cultures in the context of globalization. Please share your thoughts on this and how can contemporary cross-cultural researchers reconcile the model's structuralist foundations with the fluid hybrid identities emerging in transnational societies. It's a very long question, but I hope you got it.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm not sure I broke the whole question, but the question is really powerful, and I think it really gets to the crux of the matter. So, I think Hofstede. I think one thing that Hofstede does, and I'm not sure we have the time to do so. But maybe I can just give you a quick intellectual history of why I think Hofstede is very important, even if I fundamentally disagree with him. And his project is, there was a project at Harvard in the 50s that sought to map different cultures and value systems in the world. So this project was led by an anthropologist called Clyde Clarkhorn. And they basically did most of this work in the Americas. And they were trying to show like different ways, like different values play out. So this kind of project you locate it in a discipline called ethnology. And the short answer is it failed because of the complexities. So Hofstede's engagement here is that Hofstede lands on this data set. And Hofstede, Mark you, already knows of this failed project that happened in the 50s at Harvard. And he knows the complexities because Clyde Blackhorn published a book in, I think, 1954, and they had like over 50 definitions of culture. So there was all of this complex and confusion. But I think what Hofstede does is he goes to this data set in IBM that is answered by over 100,000 people across time, and it doesn't make sense to him initially. It only makes sense to him when he aggregates data on a national scale. So I think for me, that is really important, but also because IBM's offices were distributed all over the world, not sure in Africa, but in many parts of the world, in a way his data set is doing very many things for him. It's giving him a standardized group of people. The sampling space is basically good. I think his power strategy, statistical power is also very good. Also, it's giving him the temporal shift where he can actually look at how things are changing across time. But then also, it enables him to come up with these kind of dimensions and compare. So I think for me, it answers the question of globalization, of technology change and the like. But I think where it fails comes back to the question on how to think about structuralism. And I'm not sure we have the time to go into like structuralism, form of like linguistics and post-structuralism, the critiques of that. But I think one thing that I can mention is that there has been a lot of changes from both from a cross-sectional, cross-cultural kind of side. But what structuralism gives us is that, and again, it nicely gives us a common language between how to think about culture and how it's changing, but also how to think about structuralism from a very grounded, empirical machine learning point of view. So I've already explained structuralism from a cultural standpoint. Structuralism from a machine learning point of view, you can think about it about this quote by Firth from 1957, which is you can know a word by the company it keeps. So basically, it enables us to know that words can only make meaning based on the embedding space they occupy. So you have to spread out the word, and I think I probably have a demo of these. If I have the word orange here, if it's one word, it doesn't maybe make sense. Maybe it makes sense in a different way. If I have orange in another way, it means something else. And so I think the structuralism in this case has been proven in language. So I think maybe these programs are not connected, and actually there's a very nice book that was published this year called Language Machines that basically tries to draw these connections between structuralism, both from a linguistic standpoint and how it's been operationalized in machine learning, but also like structuralism in like culture and society. So I'm not sure this answer is satisfying, but I think we are at a very interesting point to actually advance science.
Yeah, I think it does, and I agree with you. And actually, one of the research we conducted on evaluating large language models on low resource languages like Swahili, we realized LLMs have advanced in a way that they can generate, language correctly, but when you look at their output keenly, you'll find that some LLMs are actually not contextually or even culturally relevant in their generations. So this is something that culture is an ongoing topic right now, and it's very hot because models are good at they generate well if it is language, good language, but culture-wise, I think they are still very poor. With advanced LLMs like GPT trying to be a little bit more contextual, but not very well, not up to what humans would expect. So My question is, for AI researchers, engineers trying to be more aware or trying to become more sensitive to cultural context, like what advice would you give us, maybe as your last um, words for us, Daniel?
Yeah, thanks, Millicent. I read your paper. I thought it was very insightful, and I liked the data set. You used
Yeah,
WhatsApp conversations, and I thought
yeah,
that was around it. And the qualitative insights drawn by ethnomethodology, I thought were really insightful. And I think in very many parts spoke to my charge against what I'm calling against softmaxing culture, where the tendency of these systems to produce default or Western dominated kind of language at the expense of these locally relevant cultural expressions. So I think that the advice really for me, I've captured most of it in design implications. But I think one thing that I'm going to emphasize and maybe plug a few papers. There is a paper from Microsoft Research led by Hannah Wallach. It's a position paper. I think it's coming to at NeurIPS this year. It says that I think generative AI is a social science challenge, and of course, what we know is that the current benchmarks, and of course, we can't really ignore the politics and the geopolitics of AI, issues happening right now. But I think the paper, the nice point it really makes is that it recognizes that current benchmarks and evaluations are good enough. And in a way, machine learning practice is kind of being let off the hook. But I think ultimately, and where we're going, as we think about AI alignment and cultural alignment, importantly, we really have to think of not only, again, this is a very radical point, not only of cross interdisciplinary collaborations. I think it's a high time to do integrative work. I'm not very optimistic about this, the funding that would promote this kind of work, but I think for me, this is the advice that I would encourage so that we can have more sensitive and aligned tools and services for different contexts.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniel. Once again, this was quite insightful. Thanks for coming in to give us this exciting talk. At this point, I'll just end the call and thank you everybody for joining, and we'll send invitation for the next seminar. Thank
All right,
you.
thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.